Thank you, Seth, and thank you all for joining us today. Today, we are talking about People Are Respected. It's our grand finale for our Personal Outcome Measures webinar series. If you have a Personal Outcome Measures manual, it may be handy to have that available for today's presentation. So for today, we want to place this outcome within the context of all of the other outcomes within this outcome area of human security. So human security indicators are essential, non-negotiable human and civil rights. People who receive services must be treated the same as people who do not. They must have dignity and respect, social stability, and security. For today's webinar, we hope to explore the key concepts and issues of People Are Respected, the discovery process, how to make decisions effectively, how we support people to feel respected, and we hope to share some tips for success. We continue to build consistency and reliability with decision-making and data around the personal outcome measures. And so again, this is our grand finale. Check out the other webinars that we've done on the other outcomes in this series as well. So we want to begin with your perspective. What does being respected mean to you? So go ahead, use the Q&A box on your Zoom control panel and share your perspective. What does being respected mean to you? We'll come back in just a few minutes and read some of your answers. So if you have interacted with the personal outcome measures in some way, you may have heard about this concept of the big R in respect. So what is this all about? Here are some key concepts of the big R. First of all, presumed competence, assuming that I am capable of making all decisions. Think about what this might look like in action. It may mean refraining from blanket policies that might limit people's decision-making authority. It might mean seeking input before implementing changes that would affect people and taking actions based on people's feedback. The big R is about choice, supporting people to make real choices about their lives, even when others might not agree with these choices, and even when these choices involve a degree of risk. It is also about control. Do people that you support have the same degree of control over their lives that you have in yours? Why or why not? What can we do to intentionally return control to people that receive supports? Consider dignity of risk. We all make choices that involve a degree of risk. When we make a choice and the outcome of that choice has unanticipated consequences, we might call it a mistake. Mistakes are an important part of human development, growth, and learning. It is important for people to experience consequences so they can learn how to make better choices. When we create environments for people that prevent them from ever experiencing negative consequences, we are denying them the opportunity to learn. While we may need to provide the support necessary to prevent total disasters or outcomes that might truly harm a person, it is important that we support dignity of risk and support people to evaluate and experience consequences. We should provide the opportunity to learn about responsibilities and possible consequences, but ultimately support people to make their own choice. The big R is about being challenged. If your boss gives you a challenging assignment or project, you may grumble about it, but this is ultimately a sign of respect. They know that you can get it done. Truly showing respect means that we are challenging people, giving them a gentle push to try new experiences and overcome barriers to have the lives that they really want to live. So in summary, the big R of respect means that we are respecting people with our actions, not just our words. Respect goes well beyond being kind or showing affection. Our actions are what truly demonstrate whether or not we are truly respecting people. We want to look at the big R across the person's life as we take a holistic approach to all of the outcomes. This includes the actions that we take to support respect across a person's entire life. The 3 E's are a foundational element of respect, as is true with the other 20 outcomes. When we talk about informed choice, there must be evidence of experience, education, and exposure. When we refer to choices, we refer to the same array of options and choices available to all citizens, and one must take into consideration the age of the person. Throughout the decision-making questions, you will find this language. In making determinations on some of the outcome measurements, this concept will come into play. People must have been given the information in a way that they understand or is adapted to their unique situation and have the experience to deepen their understanding. Then the person must have the opportunity to try out or consider different options through exposure. Our supports should be active rather than passive. We should be actively supporting people to have experience, education, and exposure. If informed choice is not present, the outcome remains an opportunity. In that sense, the 3 E's are critical in evaluating this outcome. Okay, so let's hear from you all. What does respect mean to you? Seth?
Yeah, there are a lot of really good responses, so thank you everyone for sharing. Wendy shared that being treated well as a valued human being and doing to others as you would have done unto you. Matt shared the golden rule, treat others the way that you want to be treated. Sandy, being asked for my thoughts and opinions and feeling that their input is valued. Ivy shared being heard and considered. A lot of responses have been surrounding being listened to. Sherry, being listened to, making my own decisions. Lois, people trusting them as a professional and a peer. Eric shared being valued, relied upon, and included. So thank you everyone for all those responses.
Yeah, great responses. Thank you everybody for your perspective. Yeah.
We need to spend a little time now looking at some of the key concepts we need to remember when looking at the outcome, people are respected. It includes showing regard and consideration for the person, including their gender preferences and identity, learning about and respecting the cultural and spiritual preferences of the person. As with the other 20 outcomes, respect is defined by the person. You already shared some of the important things to you when it comes to respect, including being listened to, being asked your thoughts and opinions, etc. And we want to learn what the person that we are working with, how they define respect. In interviewing people, it is also important that we understand their definition well. This may vary widely from person to person, depending on their preferences, background, culture, upbringing, beliefs, etc. It is also very important that we support people in understanding respect. What about when a person says they are respected? When you ask them, they might say, oh, people are nice and they take me places. But you observe that they are not respected. So we should note that people who do not have not experienced respect may not know what respect should truly look like and may need support in better understanding and identifying true respect. This is again where the 3 E's are critical in evaluating this outcome. Has the person had education, experience, and exposure to fully understand respect? As with the other outcomes, we want to take a holistic picture of how the person is respected, not just how the provider or staff treat the person. We want to look at the big picture, which also includes looking at the accumulation of all the other outcomes. For this reason, determinations about the outcome respect are always made last. After we have a picture of all the outcomes, we go back and look at the area and decisions for respect. If we are not supporting people to exercise their rights, make choices, decisions, realize their goals, are we really respecting them?
Okay, so now we want to take some time to talk about how we explore this area with people. How do we get the information we need to evaluate this outcome? The goal in interviewing is to always allow the person to take the lead in the conversation. At this point in our interaction with the person, particularly because we are evaluating this outcome last, we might already have some information that we can build upon, such as something the person told us in another area. So have we learned that a person is not fully exercising their rights, as Ep mentioned? Have we learned that the person is not supported to pursue relationships or make choices? Is the person leading their own life? We may want to ask questions to follow up on something that we learned earlier. We must understand that the person's definitions of other outcomes in order to understand their definition of respect. An observation that we made in the person's environment or through their communication, such as how are others interacting with the person? Is the person making choices about the environment in which they live, such as the decor and furniture? So let's hear from you on this one as well. What might we be able to observe in a person's environment that will help us to learn about whether or not a person is being respected? So use your Q&A box and we will revisit your responses in a few minutes. What might we be able to observe? Okay, while we're waiting for that, we'll share a few examples. So does the person look to others to answer or for affirmation? We might look at, are their supporters referring to the person in the same way that they would other adults? Are other people making choices for the person? Is the person being over-supported? Are people doing things for the person? Do people answer the person's phone? Do they knock and wait for the person to answer their door? Are people supported to look their best or dress in a way that supports self-expression? And what about activities? Are they challenging? Are they meaningful and interesting? So we mentioned the crayons and coloring books, and we don't want to get caught up in that. But again, remember the 3 E's. It is more productive to explore how the person has been challenged to explore varied and diverse activities. So if the person enjoys art, Have they tried paint and canvas? Have they tried a pottery wheel? Again, the 3 E's are going to be critical in the evaluation of respect. So in terms of discovery, page 36 of your personal outcome measures manual offers suggested questions for the person and those that know the person well. Remember, these are suggested questions. These are the types of questions that you should be asking. They are not always the questions that you should be asking. The suggested questions in your manual are not intended to be a script. It is important that your questions are individualized and you are using what you learn to ask questions that are based on the person's unique individual circumstances and perspective. As with all of the other outcomes, your questions should be open-ended as much as possible. Here are some considerations for the development of good questions in this area. Explore how respect is demonstrated and focus on control and the day-to-day exercise of rights. Who chooses? Whether that's who chooses what time you wake up or who chooses your shampoo. Who decides? Okay, these are all good questions that are going to inform you about day-to-day and the amount of control that the person has over their own lives. Okay, so we have lots of good questions in the book. Here's some other questions that you might want to ask. What makes you feel respected by others? Who's your biggest fan or cheerleader, and what do they do that makes you know they are always cheering you on? Does anyone make decisions for you without asking you your opinions? Who opens your mail? Who chooses what goals you work on? Who decides who will be at your meetings? How are you involved in conversations about the things you are interested in? How do you know if people respect you? And what does respect look like to you? As we've already mentioned, questions that we ask about other outcome areas will help to inform this one as well. Okay, so let's hear from you now, your input as far as what can we observe that might inform us about this outcome.
Yeah, again, some really good responses from our attendees. Amy shared, does the person have a key to their home? Are their belongings sequestered to their room? Do they have a role in the aesthetic of their home? Are they afforded privacy? Noelle shared how staff and peers interact with them, how they talk to them, the tone, the body language, challenging them to be doing as much as they can. Becky shared, what does the person's day look like? What type of activities are they taking part in? Deborah shared the person's individual style is reflected in their clothing, their hairstyles, the room decor. Curtis responded with, if goals are actually the goals of the person and our life objectives and that they are changed, that people can tell you something that they have accomplished and that they're proud of. Pat shared kind of similar lines. Do they have, their own room? Do they have a say in what they eat? So some really good responses from everyone. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks everybody for your insight. So we are repeating this intentionally. Of course, we want to make sure you remember this is so critical. The 3 E's, right? Education, experience, and exposure. Are people making informed choices about whether or not they are respected? Yep.
Okay, so let's move on and start looking at decision making. Decision making is where we decide whether the personal outcomes and the individualized supports are present. It's important that we apply all the evidence that we have collected. And remember, we said to leave the respected area for last so that you have been able to collect all the evidence. To review the decision-making process, there are several important considerations. First, remember always it's one person at a time, looking at the evidence gathered for just this one person that is being visited. Next, it's having an awareness of the important information about the personal outcome measures, which includes such things as the values and the principles which are outlined in the manual. And you can review them on page 35 of the manual. And they play an important part too, understanding them. Next, as we've covered, there's also the information gathering and discovery piece. And this includes the information collected from the person, supporters, environments, and at times also written materials. And finally, the decision-making component. The outcome has a series of questions that lead to the decision, the data that's being collected, about whether the outcome and the individual supports are present or not. This decision-making process presents questions in a decision-making matrix for measuring both the outcome and the individualized supports for the person, and are found on page 39. So now some basic decision-making, basic ideas for decision-making that are outlined here. If you have available, please turn to page 37. It will help you take a close look on the way to use the manual and the process for decision making. When making decisions, you always use the manual. Always use the manual. Always use the manual. Can't stress that enough. So be sure that you have your manual with you when you get to this process, and also reference the additional considerations, which we'll discuss in a minute, that are also on page 39. Remember, we must be able to prove the presence of an outcome and support with the evidence, the facts that we have collected. Our default is that the outcome is an opportunity until we can prove otherwise. So let's take a look at the decision-making criteria for the outcome that's on page 37. Take a look at the language identified in this area for 7.2 and 7.3. And this is where the big R that we discussed earlier really comes into play, and is an inquiry into how we are respecting people with our actions. Okay? The question that needs to be answered for 7.2, which says, do interactions with others reflect concern for the person's opinions, feelings, and preferences, involves listening and acting based on the person's unique individual preferences. Okay, so there's the acting upon through the interactions. For 7.3, the highlights, that highlights opportunities to participate in challenging and interesting activities, is about the 3 R's that Michael's discussed several times: informed choice and dignity of respect. all of this must be present in order to demonstrate the presence of the outcome. Okay, so many times people will say they are respected, but our evidence is suggesting something else. People may not realize that they are being disrespected, but you may have observed that they were. And again, this is where the 3 E's, education, experience, and exposure, play a crucial role. All of the information discovered must be incorporated, which includes what you heard, observed, sense. You had a list of those on some good suggestions in that area. In other words, what the discovery process told you, not just what the person says. Okay. So let's take a look at the individualized support decision-making criteria for the outcome, which is also on page 37. For 7A, as with other outcomes, our decision-making begins with the question regarding whether or not the organization is aware of how the person defines the outcome. And in this case, it asks what is important to the person with regard to respect. The next suggested, or the next decision-making question, then we need to assess the actions that are taken to ensure that all interactions with the person are respectful. And this includes more than just those with the provider or the family. It's the whole picture again. Pay attention to the nuance here. The term interactions goes beyond words and encompasses actions as well. We also see more actions for the next question that needs to be answered to make a decision about the support. Supports need to enhance the person's self-image, are identified and implemented. Again, actions identified and implemented. Now notice the language in this decision-making criteria implies some type of actions. As with other outcomes, we must be able to prove the presence of active rather than passive support. What actions are in place to support the person to have their defined outcome of respect? If we do not have examples, we can't prove that the support is present. Supports must be fully and robustly present, not some or part of the way there. Always look for concrete examples when you're looking at these questions to make decisions. Think about what examples do I have where I can say yes to this decision-making question. There are a few other things to consider when making decisions about the outcome and individualized supports. So also give thought to, are staff members teaching the person about respect? Are they helping the person to reach his or her goals? Are rights being respected? Is due process being followed? We should also be seeing enthusiastic support for most aspects of the person's life. It doesn't necessarily mean that all the supports have to be in place for all the outcomes, but that the person is clearly prioritizing what areas are most important to them, and their supporter understands what these priorities are and supports their attainment. Another consideration, does the person have a meaningful day? Are they supported to have a meaningful career? We should be able to observe a robust awareness of the needs and preferences of the person, as well as individualized, understandable education in areas such as rights, abuse and neglect, personal information. How are we supporting the person to understand those important outcomes in their life? We should also be able to identify challenging and interesting activities and opportunities offered to the person based on their interest, as well as understanding and active support on those outcomes based on the person's preferences. So individualized supports are actually being acted upon and being implemented. This would impact whether or not the supports in place are robust as they should be. So, looking at the additional considerations, which are also on page 37 in the manual on the bottom of the page. And as you see, one of the additional consideration looks at isolated examples. So what do we mean by an isolated example? Here are a few considerations. If it happens more than once, there's numerous examples, there's ongoing disrespect, this is not an isolated example. Isolated means single, lone, unique. If the person is not able to identify anything wrong with the way they are being treated, they're not recognizing the disrespect, one would want to, again, see the 3 E's in helping the person truly understand and require respect. It's important to understand the impact on the person and whether or not the person is experiencing distress in any way due to disrespect. So those, if the isolated incident is clearly unresolved, then you don't have closure on the incident, and that may make it an ongoing example that does need to be addressed, and it wouldn't just be an isolated example anymore. Second consideration speaks to how service, supports, activities, interactions must enhance the person's self-image and promote a positive image to others. So you can see that as the second bullet in the additional consideration, that the services and supports must enhance the person's self-image and promote a positive image of that person to others. Okay. So looking at, again, the 3 E's, and we just can't stress this enough in the area of respect because it's so important and crucial in making decisions about the outcome and the individualized supports. When we look at making decisions about the outcome, remember that having education, experience, exposure is crucial for making the informed decisions and making informed, and it's important that the person has been able to make informed choices about what respect should look like for them. We also want to ask how the 3 E's played out in the person's life to know that he or she has what they truly want or are actively working towards. So are my choices in life, is the control I have on my life, are those decisions that I'm making in those areas from an informed choice due to having education, experience, and exposure. For decision-making on individualized supports, we want active efforts, which would include to know the person's preferences, because we need to know the person's perspective, be proactive in providing supports and not waiting for the person to ask for something, but taking proactive and learning from them, to provide robust support to the person, and also to assist the person to learn new and additional skills. So those are all areas that we also want to give consideration to when we're making decisions in this area. As you work at having a true sense of what this outcome and supports encompass, we also want you to remember respect goes way beyond being satisfied. Don't think in terms of he's satisfied, he's never complained about that, he's never asked for that. Look at how one can provide education, experience, and exposure to expand the person's horizons. We also talk about the importance of having robust supports and taking those supports to the next level in always supporting people to continually grow, not just ending a support when they've reached a certain area, when they've accomplished something in their lives, when they've accomplished a skill, but to always support the person in constantly growing. As with all supports, they must be individualized to meet the person's preferences and needs of the person. It's not just a policy or a procedures or a program. Within that, the steps and the actions we take need to be individualized for that person. Organizational procedures and supports should be aligned with the principle we discussed during the last hour, found on page 35, including dignity of respect, holistic approach outside of the service provider and the person's whole life, choice, control, having the same respect as you identified for yourself at the beginning of the webinar.
Okay, so let's cover some tips for success for people are respected. All right, so importantly, we want to make sure that we are looking back at all of the other outcomes that we're making this decision last. It's important that we are not just simply asking, are you treated with respect? So asking the person whether or not they feel respected assumes that the person has the proper context in which to place this question. So if you have been treated disrespectfully your whole life, you may not realize that you are experiencing disrespect. And remember, we want to ask these in a way that is open-ended. So just asking, are you treated with respect, getting a yes or no, is not going to add that much value to the conversation. A lack of information or examples of not being respected does not make this outcome present. So our default here is that this outcome is an opportunity And we must gather enough evidence to prove that it is present. So just because we don't have any examples of disrespect, it doesn't automatically mean that the outcome is present. Again, we really need to see the 3 E's: experience, education, and exposure. How is the person being actively supported to be respected and to consider what respect should look like for them? It's important that we evaluate this outcome in a way that is holistic. This outcome looks at a person's entire life, not just where they live or where they receive services. It is important to evaluate the big picture, consider the person's family, their guardian, their place in society, as a citizen, as an employee, a friend, a tenant, a taxpayer, a whole person. We need to take that all into account. Remember the 3 E's. Once again, I know we've said it a lot, but it is that critical. The outcome cannot be present unless the 3 E's are present. Our supports should be active rather than passive. And as an interviewer, it is often helpful to ask for examples of how that support is being provided. Once again, we said it before, we'll say it again, use your book, especially during decision making. Okay. Now, let's talk about some of the common misconceptions that we see regarding this outcome. First and foremost, believing that being nice is the same thing as being respectful. So once again, remember, the big R in respect is about respecting people with your actions, not just your words. So simply being kind to people is not enough to support people to be respected. So we need to look at the big picture, the person's whole life, the big R, when we are evaluating this outcome. Another common misconception that we see, indicating this outcome as present when only some people are respecting the person. So remember, this really includes everybody and all of a person's various life situations, okay? We need to evaluate all of that, not just what happens in the setting of services. All right, finally, some people say they feel respected, but other evidence indicates they are not. And again, this is really important. People may not realize they are being disrespected if they've never experienced real respect, okay? So it's important to evaluate all of that evidence when we are making that decision and evaluating this outcome. Okay. So lots of great conversations today, lots of great conversations about respect. Check out our social media. We have lots of great conversations there as well. We have a Facebook group, the CQLE community. Check out our other social media sites as well. All right, so I think we have a bit of time here to answer some questions if we have any questions. Seth?
We do, yeah. So one attendee asked, does culture and language fit into 7.2? And if people don't have their manuals out in front of them, I can read that. Do interactions with others reflect concern for the person's opinions, feelings, and preferences? So they're asking, does culture and language fit into that, Michael and Ed?
Short answer, yes. Yeah, absolutely. You know, so again, we're really looking at the big picture here. And as Epp mentioned, interactions is not just conversations. This may be highly nuanced, but interactions mean everything. You know, it means our actions, what language we're using. Are we referring to the person and talking to them like an adult, consistent with the way that we treat other adults. So yes, language and culture certainly fit quite well into 7.2. Great question. Thank you.
And are we supporting the individual to follow their culture and traditions if that's important and means respect to them?
That's a very good point. And we do have one more question. Michael, you kind of covered this a little bit in your tips and misconceptions section, but we'll ask it again just to kind of reinforce. One attendee said they struggle with deciding the outcome, that if the person says they're respected, but we think we see otherwise and say the outcome is not present, how do we know that we're not imposing our own definition of respect and not the person's definition?
Yeah, great question. So again, remember, it's really about the 3 E's, right? Informed choice, having the context necessary to understand, am I being respected? Am I being disrespected? So you're absolutely correct in that we want to avoid inserting our own definitions on the person's definition of the outcome, but people are not going to be able to define this outcome unless they've had that experience, education, and exposure. So that really is the critical piece here when evaluating this. It really is important that they've had the experience necessary to recognize whether or not they're being respected or not.
A reminder to everyone to please submit your questions through the Q&A box, because at this point we don't have any more questions, but we want to give everyone maybe just a couple more seconds before finishing the webinar. If you have any questions, please submit those. And as Michael and Ep have referenced a couple times throughout the webinar, we do have quite a few resources on our website related to respect. Most recently, this year, we did have a capstone newsletter article that was devoted to kind of subtle signs of disrespect that sometimes our staff see while conducting CQ activities. So that's a good resource to check out, along with, obviously, like Michael had referenced at the beginning of this webinar, all of the other POM indicator webinar sessions that we've held as part of this series. I'm not seeing any other questions come in. Of course, if you want to go to the next slide, you can always, for sure, submit your questions directly to Michael and Ep. They're always more than willing to answer any questions you might have.
Mm-hmm.
So we did have a question just come in. If CQL was doing a POM interview, would you be looking for a form or a certain type of documentation for the 3 E's?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, it really, again, it's going to be the big picture, right? So we're going to be evaluating everything. And, sometimes we do a record review as part of a conversation with a person, of course, with their permission. If they provide permission, we may look at their record, but we're really trying to understand their definitions of the outcomes and their unique perspective. So that's not something that we always do. Certainly, documents might be one piece of evidence, but we're going to be looking at the big picture. And a lot of that's going to be conversation with the person, observations that we make when we're having the conversation with the person, what someone who knows that person well is able to tell us, and really just evaluating all of it. So while that might be one piece of evidence, that certainly wouldn't be the entire body of evidence that we'd consider.
And then we did just have another question come in. How can the indicators be corrected if what the participant's saying is different from what is being evaluated?
Not sure I understand.
Yeah, I didn't get that one either. Maybe that person could clarify just a little.
I was interpreting it as if there's a discrepancy between what you're learning through the POM interview and maybe other things that you're seeing, or maybe questions with the support providers, the staff member.
Oh, gotcha. Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, if that's the intent of the question, then we, we do get that sometimes. Sometimes the person might tell us one thing and the person who knows that person well tell us something else. And so again, looking at the big picture, all of the evidence that we've collected, it's possible that the person that knows the person well, the staff member or other person that we're following up with, might not have been aware of how the person defines the outcome. Sometimes people tell us certain things, and it's important that we don't judge what they're saying us. The person is always going to be the expert on their definitions of the outcome. So we really have to take that as face value. And because it's going to help us to understand how the person defines the outcome. So it's not as important to decide whether or not something is true as it is understanding how the person defines the outcome. That really is the entire goal here with the personal outcome measures. Ep, did you have anything to add to that?
I was thinking how you also talked about, when you're looking at the decision-making questions, having examples in responding to this. This is the way that I heard about actions. This was implementation. This was holistic. And I think, getting and looking and giving thought to those examples would be important too.
Great. Well, there are no additional questions at this time. So I just want to thank, all of our attendees for coming today and being so engaged and involved through, your chat responses and your questions. And also, of course, thanking Michael and Ep for the presentation today. I think everyone really enjoyed it. It was very well done. Thank you, Michael and Ep. Any final words, Michael and Ep?
No, thanks everybody. Thanks for your participation, and happy holidays.